Hi, I'm Phil Craig.
And I'm Andrew Loney.
And together we aim to bring you the most scandalous stories and some of the most scandalous people in history. So thanks for joining us here on the Scandalmongers podcast. Well, welcome. Here we are. We're exiled from our beautifully appointed studio for this week's edition of our lovely podcast. And I've been traveling.
Yes. Well, you've been away. Where have you been?
I have been to the beautiful island of Madeira.
Right. And how was that?
It was brilliant. The best bit, though, was sitting by the pool, watching stories go all around the world based on our last episode of our podcast.
Yes.
All about Diana.
We've made it. Yeah, exactly. Amazing. Yeah.
That was very exciting.
And we've also had some feedback on the show, haven't we? And what people want to hear and some suggestions for future programs.
We are starting to get feedback. They say I talk too much. So I'm going to communicate myself in a different medium. This is how I'm feeling.
Aha. That says it all, doesn't it? That's what we're going to be talking about today, as every week.
Well, actually, I'm hoping you will do the bulk of the talking because this is, here is another visual aid. We're going to be talking about Guy Burgess, The Cambridge Spies, and Andrew's brilliant book, in which he looks a bit like Guy Burgess.
He does, doesn't it? Exactly. Same hair.
Same background, I reckon.
Yes. Same clothes.
So yeah, we'll be joined shortly by a special guest on our little Zoom. But first of all, for people who don't know, because all of this happened a long time ago, who were the Cambridge Spies? Who was Guy Burgess? Why should we care?
Well, the Cambridge Spies were a group of Cambridge undergraduates recruited in the 1930s to spy for Russia. They all knew each other, which of course goes against tradecraft. They originally recruited by the first of the Cambridge Five, Kim Philby, and he recruited Donald Maclean and then Guy Burgess. And then Guy Burgess in turn recruited Anthony Blunt and John Cairncross. But we talk about the Cambridge Five. I think we should more honestly talk about the Cambridge 50 because it was a much bigger group than we realize. And they were probably the most effective group aspiring in history. They all penetrated the Foreign Office, the intelligence services, the civil service. And when I wrote my book on Guy Burgess in 2015, it was the first proper biography of Burgess. He'd always been seen as a bit player. And I think what I hope I showed was that he was a much more important, perhaps the most important figure. And I think we care about it partly because of the intelligence that they betrayed to the Russians, of course, at a crucial time because of their high positions, but also this idea of these people who had pretty privileged lives. They came from public schools. They say they'd all been at Cambridge together, who then, in a sense, had all the benefits of this sort of lifestyle and yet, in a sense, sought to betray it. I mean, they were sort of running with the hares and the hounds. And I think that's what's always intrigued people. Plus the story that there must be others. There was perhaps an Oxford ring, and also that there were perhaps many more people in this ring. We've only had some of the papers released, and there's a lot more, I hope, still to come out. Our guest, Nigel West, may be able to shed some light on that. I mean, there have even been releases in the last few weeks relating to the story. So the story goes on. I think there are many more people to be revealed. And the attraction of someone like Guy Burgess is that he had this hinterland. He worked in the BBC, he wrote articles, he knew everyone from, George Orwell to Noel Coward and he moved in pretty glittering circles. He was outrageous. He hid in open view his homosexuality and his communism. And so he is a very sort of rich subject for a biography. And one of the fortunate things I had when I started researching this in 1984 was that many of the people who knew him were still alive. I was able to interview, for example, his former lovers. And also, by the time the book came out, some files were being released. So I had the benefit of looking at the files, including some 300 files that were released as the book came out, relating to the security investigations into his disappearance in 1951.
Okay, wow, that's a very amazing introduction to Burgess and the Cambridge spy ring. I mean, just going back a little bit, I think a lot of our viewers, listeners, won't quite understand just how big a scandal this was and how long it lasted. I mean, really, from the 50s to the late 70s, there was almost monthly speculation. Who was the second man? Who was the third man? Was there a fourth man, a fifth man? Was there a woman? And I remember at the beginning of my career in television interviewing, was it Andrew Boyle, who wrote Climate of Treason in '79, I think.
Yeah, and that was the book that really exposed Blunt. As you say, there was a sort of, it almost paralyzed
story, and it went on for absolutely ages. I mean,
it still goes on. Goes on. I mean, the new releases have suggested that the sixth man was in fact a woman called Flora Solomon. But as you say, it paralyzed the intelligence services. I mean, there were all these witch hunts going on in this wilderness of mirrors. Who could you trust? Who could you believe? And literally, as you say, every Sunday, the Sunday Times or someone would have a story relating to the Cambridge spy ring. I mean, Chapman Pincher produced a book almost every year on the subject, based on leaks from people like Peter Wright. So it was exciting. And I mean, we were both at Cambridge about the same time as these stories were really running with the exposure of Blunt. It was sort of cowboys and Indians, and we were still living in the Cold War. These things sort of mattered.
Wow. I mean,
they're seen as historical now, but at the time they felt very, very real.
It's an interesting kind of insight into the intellectual atmosphere of the 1930s, isn't it? That these men, and they were mostly men, from the pinnacle of the establishment, the best schools, the best universities, came to despise their own country, its role in the world, its place in the world. Of course, we're living through the Depression. There's massive unemployment. There's hunger marches. There's the British Empire. There are massacres in India. And now there's this new model in Moscow and the state, which of course had its own problems, which they mostly ignored, but was seen almost like a quasi-religious cause that you could join, like a priesthood, to serve this new vision of humanity and move on from this kind of dead old world of Britain and all the dying.
I think that's right. I think there was a political revolt with all of them, but there was also a personal revolt. There was often another reason. I mean, the Russian intelligence services took on the role of absent fathers. Many of them had lost their fathers either through separation or death. And someone like Guy Burgess, I think, wanted to épater la bourgeoisie. He resented. He hadn't, in a sense, been the success that he hoped. And this was a way of making himself a bigger person. I think some, like Philby, were natural deceivers, and others, like Blunt, were brought in because they believed in the Marxist interpretation of art, and was brought in by Burgess. So they all had their slightly different reasons to get involved. But you're absolutely right. They talk about this pistol shot in the dark, this one moment in the 30s. And it was really the early 30s that persuaded this generation to feel that the only future lay in supporting the Popular Front and communism.
And that they could be part of creating a new world and sweeping away an old world that they didn't like. There's an amazing picture here from your own book. I don't know if anybody can make any sense of this picture.
That sums it up, doesn't he?
For those on Spotify, it's a picture of a rather loose-looking Burgess, sort of half asleep and smirking at the camera in front of a very posh kind of country house with a butler straight out of Downton Abbey walking by with cups of tea. And you just sort of think, I'm going to bring all of you bastards down. Is what he's
well, I think the irony is there were sort of hypocrites. He'd just gone out in support of the waiters at Trinity College, Cambridge, where he was, that they should have better terms. And yet when I talked to his brother about how he behaved towards the staff, because he came from this very privileged background where they had staff, no one, he said, was ruder to the servants than Guy.
Really?
So that this is, again, it's this mixture of this very complicated psychological background to the story, which
I do love this aspect. I love this aspect of your book, actually. I really should say, Christmas is coming. This is a great gift for anybody. Andrew really does intertwine the political and social story of Britain and the world at that time with a wonderfully precise analysis of Burgess's own kind of unique psychology and his kind of strangely kind of dangerous libertine lifestyle. And it's the establishment, it seems so forgiving. The more outrageous he is, the more he behaves like no spy could possibly behave, the more he's trusted, is ushered into yet another sanctum of the establishment. The Foreign Office, the BBC, the British Embassy in Washington, the Secret Service itself. And yet he's living absolutely on the edge in kind of any way you can imagine it. Remarkable.
Well, exactly. I mean, one of the points they said was indiscretion is not normally the characteristic of a spy. And so, exactly, it was a very, very clever disguise. And he would often confess to being a spy, and people would say that's just being Guy being outrageous.
Wow.
But actually, in his cups, he was telling them the truth.
And so the guy, there was a Russian agent, wasn't there? Or maybe he was British, or was he Welsh? I can't remember. In Cambridge. And the Russians, Soviets were very clever. This is quite early in the story of the Soviet Union. But they must have sensed that there were people in the establishment of Britain, maybe other places too, who could be kind of recruited while they were young, who were destined for great things and could perhaps help the Soviet Union for the rest of their lives. And they were called sleepers, weren't they?
Or moles, exactly. And it was very clever. You know, and of course, Le Carre writes about this a lot. But by taking this very long-term view, by penetrating the establishment, I think they recognized how influential these a very narrow group of people were likely to be. It was easy to spot them. They were going to go on to great things, whatever happened. And by just ensuring that they ended up in the right spot, they were able to wreak enormous damage. And of course, they were all jolly good chaps, so no one bothered vetting them. And they were able to operate with impunity, really. And it was only the flight in 1951, because of some code breaking, that the network began to unravel. And even now, as I say, we don't know the full extent of the network.
Well, before, we're going to invite Nigel to join us in about 3 minutes. But what happened in 51? Why was that such an extraordinary story? Perhaps one of the
51 is in a sense when the balloon went up. What happened is American code breakers were beginning to break Russian codes. They identified Donald McLean as a spy. Burgess was basically tasked to escort him out of Britain. I think the feeling was that Burgess was a burnt-out case, and that it was a convenient device to get him out as well. Though there's some debate about whether he was tricked or he knew he was going. And they disappeared. There was a big cover-up. We can talk a bit about that later on by the establishment. They didn't come clean about it. They pretended it was just a drunken homosexual escapade. But the story was leaked by the French police. And really, from 1951, it has been a huge cause célèbre. It affected relations with the Americans because they felt that we hadn't been entirely honest with them. It led to reduced cooperation on things like nuclear secrets. So it had a big impact. And I think it also was the beginning of the challenge or a feeling that the establishment were perhaps not always operating in a very ethical way. And, you know, we now have much more distrust of the establishment. And I think it really began from this point in 1951.
Fascinating. All right. Well, I'm now going to try for the first time to introduce a live guest, our little podcast. So let's see if this works. Standing by.
Good evening.
Good evening. Thank you so much, Nigel, for joining us. I was just about to say we're very fortunate to have you because you probably, and you can't say this, but I can, are the most distinguished writer on intelligence at the moment, an extraordinary range of books that you've talked about going back over 40 years. And you know an awful lot about the Cambridge. Sorry?
I'm not here to be insulted.
But you've worked on this story now for a long time. I mean, going right back, I think, to the 1970s, and continue, I think, to show an interest. And I was just saying to Phil, new material has even just been released into the archives recently, which adds a little bit to the story.
Yes,
can you sort of comment on that?
The exciting aspect to the study of intelligence is that you never get the whole story. And that thanks to the treasure trove at Kew, the National Archives, where there are 6,500 MI5 personal files declassified, this is just a wonderful golden era for looking at the world of espionage in a way that has never been possible before. And I think that there is one other thing to say about this, that hitherto, people who relied on interviews and even documents gleaned from various different sources could never be entirely certain of the accuracy of the material that they were looking at. Whereas now, looking at MI5's contemporaneous material from the date of its inception, this material was constructed, written, prepared, reported on by people who had no expectation that anybody other than a more senior officer would read their material. And that's very important to bear in mind.
That's so. Nigel, can I just ask you a question? Are you determined to be a man of mystery today, or would you like to turn your camera on?
I thought my camera was on, but apparently it's not.
No, it's not, but we thought maybe you just wanted to live in the shadows. But it's up to you.
No. I will see if I can get it on.
There's usually a video.
Start video?
Yes, that would be it. Now
we have. But in some ways, we need a bit of caution here because these are investigatory files and they only reflect what people are telling the investigators. It's not necessarily the truth, is it? It's building the mosaic.
And that is particularly true of the FBI files, where certainly in MI5 documents, there is a tendency to say, we can dismiss this, or this is contradicted by some other item. And they're quite scrupulous in that objectivity of the kind that you would expect from the barristers and solicitors who were in those jobs before they were recruited into MI5. On the other hand, the FBI, I think, can be criticized for just taking everything without comment and putting it in their files, leaving historians 50 years later to make terrible mistakes and to claim, for instance, that the FBI thought that John Lennon was a terrorist. This kind of thing appears all the time in American material because the FBI in particular did not discriminate. They took all the information without commenting on its authenticity at the time.
Do you think one of the problems is that there's this drip feed of material? I mean, we've got the 6,000 files, but they're not really pushed out in chronological order. So we get a little bit here, a little bit there. And
Andrew, don't complain, otherwise they'll close off the gap.
I mean, there's a lot. I mean, it's ironic, isn't it? In some ways, the most secret organization is the most open in terms of producing files. And it's created this bonanza, really, of intelligence writing.
Has it never occurred to you that if of all the departments in Whitehall, arguably the most secret department, namely the Secret Intelligence Service or MI5, are probably the departments that have had more books written about them than any other?
Right. Well, yes. Well, maybe they should just be more secretive, like the Cabinet Office, and that would shut things down on things.
Can I, speaking as the non-expert of this group in this field, I would love to hear you, the two of you, talking, me and other lay people who may be listening, just through the basic architecture of how the various men emerged over the years. Because this was something that took 20, 25 years, maybe it's not even over yet. And it's such an amazing tale. So how did it start and how did it progress?
Well, leave it to Nigel. I mean, does it really begin in 1951?
You're talking about the Cambridge Five
yes,
in particular?
Well, the Cambridge 50, I call them.
You're probably right. I think it goes back to 1934. I think it goes back to Kim Philby. None of this would have happened without Kim Philby falling head over heels in love with an Austrian Jewish lady, Lizzie, Friedman, who he subsequently married. And I think that it all centers around Kim Philby because he then, on the direction of his Soviet contact, went to Guy Burgess and recruited Guy Burgess and recruited Donald MacLean. And that I think was the origins. I think that you have to look at Kim Philby, who had no expectation of ever getting a decent job because Professor Robertson at Cambridge had written a very disagreeable reference for Philby in an attempt to make sure he never got a job in the civil service. So Philby had no expectation of ever reaching classified information. It was his contacts, people like Burgess and Acclaimed and Blunt, who would turn out to be so significant and important.
And they're all still at college at this point. They're all still basically students or graduates.
No, Philby had graduated and he only went back to Cambridge after his recruitment in order to fulfill the mission that had been given by Arnold Deutsch, who was the legal resident in London. Deutsch guided Philby and told him to go back to Cambridge in order to recruit, to recommend, in effect, talent spot some of his pals, and that's precisely what he did. But it's a mistake to think that they were all at Cambridge at the same time. Some of them scarcely knew each other, and certainly John Cairncross thoroughly disliked Anthony Blunt.
But they were the same colleges within the same period of 5 or 6 years.
Yes, indeed.
But I think that the extraordinary thing, which I think Phil was hinting at, is that the story didn't really break in terms of people knowing about the treachery until much later. And there are in some ways two parallel chronologies. One is when the intelligence services had their suspicions or there were confessions, and actually when it all became public. And Phil and I were talking before you came on how even, for example, Anthony Blunt, no one knew about until 1979, even though the intelligence services had got a confession from him some 25 years earlier.
But that's right. I mean, you could say that the whole story started with the MI5 investigation that was initiated as a consequence of the Venona decrypts. And the only person to be prosecuted as a consequence of the decryption of the Venona traffic is the only person to be prosecuted, was Klaus Fuchs. Nobody else was ever prosecuted. But you could say that that was the beginning of MI5's interest, the certainty that there had been a spy in Washington in 1943 and 1944.
And then, but it took a long time for the story to become public. I mean, the idea was that this should be buried and kept away from our allies and kept away from the public, really, wasn't it?
Yes, my MI5 mentor was Arthur Martin, and he used to joke that the reason why he went to brief Hoover in 1951 after the defections of Burgess and McLean was that he was considered to be the best liar in the security service. And he went and told a pack of lies to J. Edgar Hoover. And J. Edgar Hoover had taken a pretty dim view of MI5's counterespionage abilities, really dating back to the prosecution of Klaus Fuchs and the prosecution of Alan Nunn-May.
And do you think there's a sense that, Klaus Fuchs didn't go to the right school, so he was prosecuted, and the others were allowed to escape or were given some form of immunity, that no one wanted the story to come public?
I know that that's a comforting thought to the people who are anti-establishment, but the truth is that Fuchs was stupid enough and arrogant enough to confess what he did. As Kim Philby did eventually disclose in a lecture to the KGB on only the second occasion that he ever addressed the KGB, he said they haven't got a chance of getting a conviction unless you're stupid enough to make a confession. And that went for George Blake, and that went for Klaus Fuchs, and it went for Alan Nunn-May. The only reason why Alan Nunn-May confessed was that he was absolutely terrified that he was going to be extradited to the United States because he had engaged in espionage in the United States and would face a death penalty. And it was the agreement was that he would be prosecuted in England. If he pleaded guilty, he would not be extradited to the United States, and that's exactly what happened.
But there's a big debate. I mean, Philby also confessed in Beirut in 1963, even though he'd been under suspicion since 51. And there's some suggestion that he was allowed to escape, or there was an incompetence because he wasn't under proper surveillance. And he was able to just jump on a freighter and go to Russia.
Yes, I think for some people have promoted the idea that he was allowed to wander off into the sunset. But the reality is that he was offered an immunity from prosecution. This was the instrument that subsequently was used with great effect in April 1964 against Anthony Blunt. And from a counterintelligence perspective, you're not really very interested in getting imprisonments, prosecutions, convictions. That's a job for law enforcement. From a counterintelligence perspective, you want to know what damage has been done and who the current spies are.
And if they can lead you to other spies.
Yes, and when you look at the Philby confession, which is very interesting and misfiled, which is why it's been buried for all these years, that is to be found in the Arnold Deutsch personal file in the MI5 collection. And what's fascinating about it is that it's on different sheets of paper. It's typed up, but it's just simply referred to as a memorandum with the date in January 1963. It's only when you realize what it is that you can see that this is the confession, where he starts off by being disingenuous, saying, I'm trying to be as accurate as I can, but with the passage of time, it's been quite difficult. And he goes on to name people who were communists with him at Cambridge. I mean, it's a truly astonishing document. And it's amazing that it's never been disclosed before.
You mentioned...
so you hear it for the first time on The Scandalmongers.
You do.
Very
indeed.
good to know. You mentioned that they were trying to assess, the main priority is to assess the damage and find any continuing espionage and any still active spies. Has there ever been a real audit of what the damage that was done by these men? Is it possible to sum it up in a few paragraphs? Because certainly Alan Bennett, when he wrote his play, was a bit dismissive, certainly of Burgess, sort of seemed to think, well, he was a silly man who broke the rules, but he didn't do any real damage. And I'm not sure you would agree with that.
There is a way of looking at this, which says Kim Philby didn't do a great deal of damage to British interests because the kind of information that he was passing to the Soviets during the war was order of battle material for the Secret Intelligence Service. So who fills what jobs, personality profiles. This is all information that the Soviets could have got possibly from other sources at various different times. And that in strategic terms, he did very little damage beyond persuading the Soviets that there was no chance of a separate peace, at least being negotiated in Spain, with the Allies. So to that extent, it has been argued that he didn't do a great deal of damage. And we certainly know that there has been a huge amount of exaggeration about saying that he had blood on his hands in relation to Albania. He told the Soviets that the Allies were promoting insurrection in Albania and were training agents, but that wasn't a big surprise to the Soviets because the Albanian agents that had been recruited were all thoroughly penetrated by the Albanian authorities. And so I've always been very skeptical in terms of the blood on their hands, the damage that they did.
Well, I think one of the ironies is, I mean, you've edited books from Russian archives. It was a period during Glasnost when there was some collaboration. And we know how many documents were sent to Russia, but the problem was we don't know what was done with them and whether the people were actually believed. So we have this irony that the more successful they were, the less trusted they were.
Yes, not only do I agree with that, but I was hugely entertained when I was in the KGB archives. There was such a shortage of paper during the Second World War that it was often worthwhile turning sheet over of a particular document to see what had been typed on the back, because they were recycling at a very early stage. And there was a huge amount of material, more than anybody could possibly have processed and analyzed, that came from all of these characters all the way through the Second World War. I think that the Soviets, as you rightly say, at least one time became suspicious of them because this windfall was too good to be true.
And I mean, one of the sort of themes of the scandalmongers is the sense that the establishment haven't always, in a sense, been as open as they could be. And I may be more anti-establishment than you, but I mean, do you think there's an element of that? I mean, you talk about the white paper after Burgess and Maclean escaped in 1951, and that really didn't tell the public the truth about what was happening.
No, the white paper was an absolutely shocking, really disgraceful performance. But again, it's worth remembering that although it was written by Graham Mitchell, the DG who signed off on it was Dick White. So it wasn't just Graham Mitchell that was culpable, making completely false statements, several of them, and actually completely misleading the public in that white paper. It was Dick White, who also knew the truth, who signed off on it.
And who was White? Sorry, who was White at the time?
Dick White was the Director General of the Security Service.
But do you think one of the ironies is that in some ways you're saying that, you know, they didn't do that as much damage as people think, but it did paralyze the intelligence services of both America and Britain as everyone went on this witch hunt to find out who else was before they had to clean out the stables. And in some ways, again, ironically, that was the real damage.
Well, I was very shocked a few years ago when I was looking in the archives and came across some documents that had not been digitalized. And they were the monthly reports that had been written by MI5 for the Prime Minister. And these documents, of which there were no copies made for the Cabinet Office, these documents were carried on a monthly basis by Sir David Petrie to the Prime Minister, who could read them. And he then took them away because no copies, they were too secret to be left with the Prime Minister. What were these secret documents? They were monthly reports written by Guy Liddell, which has summarized all the work during the previous 28 days of what had been going on in the security service. So the names of agents, operations being conducted, interrogations being contemplated, investigations, and so on. All of this was delegated by Guy Liddell to Anthony Blunt. And furthermore, Anthony Blunt was able to go into every single branch and section and subsection of MI5 and say, what are you doing? I'm here on the authority of the Prime Minister. And just to give you an idea of the scale of his knowledge, which far surpassed anybody else in the entire intelligence community in relation to MI5, is that I actually found in the KGB archives a memorandum from a secret organization within MI5 that was responsible for the management of agents inside neutral embassies based in London. So the officer in charge wrote to Blunt and said, you know, we've never been asked to put all the names of all these agents together on one sheet of paper. And of course, this is immensely damaging. Please may I have your undertaking that as soon as you've read it, you will destroy this document. That is the document that I found in Moscow.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Now, that does show the depth of penetration of these men. That's incredible.
And do you think that in some ways there's a big argument of who is most effective and important of the Cambridge spies? Does that make the case for Blunt?
It makes a very good case for Blunt because Blunt had this breadth of knowledge And what is even more extraordinary is that these monthly reports started in 1942, and they started as a consequence of the Director General, Sir David Petrie, having a conversation with Duff Cooper, who was the minister responsible for MI5. Duff Cooper had just had a long jolly lunch with the Prime Minister, who had said, this is more or less the correct dialogue, Duff, what are you doing these days? And Duff Cooper said, Prime Minister, I'm your Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster. There was a long silence. And the Prime Minister said, yes, but what do you actually do? And he said, well, Prime Minister, I'm in charge of MI5. I have responsibility for the security of the nation. And there was another long silence. And the Prime Minister said, what's MI5? And what do they do?
That's a bit worrying.
It beggars belief, but as a consequence of that, Duff Cooper called in David Petrie and said, we really must start briefing the Prime Minister. Desmond Morton is in and out of number 10 all the time. He has the ear of the Prime Minister. We've got to keep up our end up. We've got to show what we're doing. And that led to Blunt being authorized to go to every single section within MI5 and demand to know the effectiveness of their operations, what they were planning, the true names of their agents. I mean, it's scarcely credible.
That is amazing.
They all had their different strengths. I mean, I argue that Burgess, for example, was an agent of influence. You could argue Philby had the most senior jobs within intelligence. Do they all have different strengths? Or do you think you can actually say this was the most important? You know, Maclean with nuclear secrets or whatever.
Oh, and can you answer in 2 minutes? Because we're running out of time. I'm sorry.
I think you're right by referring to Maclean's influence, because during the Korean War, obviously he had, as head of the American Department of the Foreign Office, considerable influence. But I'm more interested in a counterintelligence perspective, and for me, that's Philby and Blunt. But of course, Burgess was the thread keeping them all together.
Well, that sounds like a good point to end. Thank you so much for joining us, Nigel. I mean, and your insights.
And it's worth it for the Churchill story alone. Absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much.
Pleasure.
Well, Phil, that was amazing. I think we're very lucky to have him, and he raised all sorts of interesting questions. I still champion Guy Burgess as the most important. But
well, I wanted to talk to you about that. I mean, but it looks like you've adopted Nigel's mysterious approach to Zoom. So I can't see you at the moment. You turned your camera off.
Oh, here we are. Sorry about that.
That's all right. All the people who are listening on Spotify will wonder what on earth I'm talking about. But then again, they probably do anyway.
Here I am in my tank top. So that was probably why I didn't want to be seen.
It's fine. You look great. It's funny. The background tells us all we need to know really about our respective commitment to our jobs. You're in a library surrounded by books. I'm in front of a bar with a picture of Australia.
That sums us up, doesn't it?
Perhaps it does. But no, it's really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, you're not, you've done a bit on intelligence, but it's a slightly sort of different world to you. Were there things that struck you in what he was saying?
Well, I'm less interested in the sort of technical side, I guess, of who betrayed who and which documents were leaked and when. I guess I'm really interested in the psychology of the period. Yep. It's such an amazing thing to betray your country like that. So, and over such a long time, and even through the war. Whereas if you got up in the 30s disliking Britain, you can kind of understand there are reasons for that. Some bad things were happening in the world, and Russia looked like a beautiful, wonderful new way of doing things. And yet, to live through this Britain's finest hour, and I think it probably still is, and still remain loyal to Stalin, and then to see all of the terrible things that he did during and immediately after the war, and still remain loyal,
Well, it's one of the big questions that we all address, and I have several chapters in the book. Why do they do it? And I think it's you pick your football team and you stick it with it, and you have to have these intellectual somersaults to justify your position, particularly during the Nazi-Soviet Pact. But you kind of leave history to judge, and history might take 200 years. I think the fascinating thing with Burgess is he never recanted. He had a terrible life in Moscow, which is captured, as you say, in the Ellen Bennett play, An Englishman Abroad, and actually Philby too. I mean, he tried to commit suicide. They both drank very heavily. In some ways, they must have been very disillusioned. They devoted their lives to this cause and found that they were just treated like just normal agents. They weren't totally trusted by the Russians. They had a pretty, if you can imagine what Moscow must have been like in the early 60s, it must have been pretty grim.
Life. Pretty grim. Well, I was reminded, and I'm sure this is not an accident, of the character Bill Hayden in Tinker Tailor, who one wonders is perhaps slightly modelled on these guys.
I think absolutely modelled on Philby, absolutely.
And when he's confronted, he says, I had to make a choice, and I wanted to make a mark on history. I think they saw themselves as grand historical characters, not just more cogs in the wheel of the British establishment, but something much grander and more exciting, more colourful.
Well, as I said with Burgess, he hadn't made much impact in terms of his life in Britain, and he thought this would be his place in history. And it has. If he hadn't been a spy, we would never have heard of him probably. And I think the thing that came across with Nigel is it was sort of good luck for the Russians that Philby, fell in love with this agent who recruited him. He came back and recruited others. And then they had these sort of jobs. I mean, they maneuvered themselves into some of these positions, but, it's pretty lucky that Blunt had that job in MI5.
Well, actually, I didn't want to contradict Nigel, but he did say he thought perhaps Blunt, Philby were the more important. But in your book, you actually quote Nigel himself. And he says that when he met with Blunt, Blunt told him that the genius person that held it all together, the key man, was Burgess.
Well, and he does say that at the end of our conversation. I mean, that the man who united them and kept pushing the thing was the sort of team leader. I suppose it's, again, how you measure it. And you talked about the audit, but it's very difficult to do an audit of treachery because you don't know who saw what and when and how they responded to it. There were so many factors, as he says, in the betrayal of the Albanians, that to pinpoint it on one particular person would be quite tricky.
I'm sure a lot of our listeners are saying, what Albanians? I mean, you're such an expert, so is Nigel. I think I know what you're talking about, but maybe you could explain what that meant.
Exactly. I think there's a real danger that the intelligence people have a sort of shorthand. But there was an attempt to infiltrate Albania with exiles to try and basically take over the government there. They're clearly close to the Soviet Union. It was an attempt to build a sort of a bridgehead for the West in Eastern Europe, and they thought that Hoxha was the way to go. But they were heavily penetrated already, these Albanian exiles, and I think they betrayed themselves as much as Philby. But I mean, the story is full of drama, and you can see how Philby picked up on it. I mean, I think the thing I find always rather chilling is the Russian official who wants to defect at the end of the war and says that he has the name of the head of British counterintelligence that he's going to pass across. And Philby realizes this is him, and he actually maneuvers to go and interview him, but he delays his trip sufficiently for the man to be picked up and executed.
Wow.
But that must have been, a very worrying moment, because these defectors are popping up, and they must have wondered how soon are we going to be rumbled. So they were living on their wits' end. I mean, what Nigel didn't talk about was the fact that when Burgess and Maclean escaped in 1951, their escape was reported on the Friday night at the end of May to MI5, and an attempt was made to chase them, but unfortunately Dick White, who was mentioned, the head of the Secret Service, wanted to do it himself, and his passport was out of date. So there are all these sort of almost Ealing comedy elements to it.
Good Lord.
But they kept the whole story quiet, and maybe on a counter intelligence basis, you don't want to reveal your hand to the enemy. You want to be able to follow investigations, but I think it did create a lot of resentment, the fact that we weren't coming clean about the degree of penetration in this country. And of course, the Americans were also penetrated. It then emerged. And they'd had the same sort of policy of penetrating Ivy League universities quite successfully. So this was a very, very effective system that the Russians had.
I mean, when you write a book about somebody, you spend an awful lot of time in their company and in the company of people that knew them. Is there anything about Burgess you found admirable? I mean, you are a bit of a rebel yourself, let's be honest.
Yeah, well, I felt very sorry for him. The research spanned 30 years. And so I went through a whole series of reactions to him, really ended up with sympathy. But at one point I said to my wife, shall we call our second child Guy? And she said, well, for the several reasons why we can't do that, not least that it's a girl. So you do get almost the Stockholm syndrome where you get drawn to people and identify with them. But yes, there probably is an element there. And it's the beginning of, in a sense, the themes of my books, which are about establishment cover-ups, because this white paper he talked about was nicknamed the whitewash paper. It was full of lies. And there were lies not just to the public, but also to fellow intelligence officers and politicians. And nothing was made. It was only because the French leaked the story a week after they went, and then we went through the farce of looking for them when they were already in Russia. Amazing. So there is a sort of parallel narrative there of what was really happening in reality and what actually, in a sense, the motions that people went through that they felt they needed to.
I mean, you've also written a lot about Traitor King, another of Andrew's books about Edward VIII and his connections to Germany and to the Nazis. And, if you're looking at it, if your primary motivation is to be an anti-fascist at that time in the 30s, and you look around the establishment of Britain and perhaps of France too, and you see there's a worrying amount of sympathy for what's happening in Germany, that's one justification, I suppose, for throwing in your lot with Stalin and co. But of course, he then signs a pact with Hitler. But I suppose they by then they were so fully in psychologically they couldn't break away, and they rationalized it as a tactical maneuver. Is that roughly what happened, do you think?
Yes, well, I mean, the Socialist Society, which were the communists in Cambridge, was the largest student society in the 1930s, and many of those people were very overt about their support. I mean, they did feel that they'd been let down by the older generation, by the only hope lay, as I say, with the communists who were standing up, of course, the fascists in Spain. But very few of them went underground like this and basically covered up their tracks. I mean, both Philby and Burgess pretended to be fascists in the 1930s. So they disguised their true feelings. And then, of course, as you say, many people, there's a close colleague of Burgess called Gromwy Rees, who we think was also recruited. He dropped out the Nazi-Soviet pact in 1939. And of course, all the way down the line, there were people, whether it was Czechoslovakia or Budapest, various things really became moments when they just had enough. And others, Eric Hobsbawm and others remained communists to the end of their lives, but did it in a very open way. I think what's intriguing is these double lives that they led. Ostensibly, these very respectable establishment figures who were actually trying to subvert it.
Amazing. Well, it's made me all the more enthusiastic for whenever we do our podcast on your Traitor King book, because it's such a fascinating time, and it never stops throwing up new insights.
Well, we've both written about the summer of 1940, and I've been told that's the most, in a sense, the least well-known period of the Second World War. There's the most hidden about what happened in the summer of 1940. So that will be a good subject for us because we both come to it from slightly different perspectives. Well,
that's right. And in fact, I think we probably have to still negotiate this between ourselves, but our next podcast might indeed be set in the summer of 1940. But until then, thank you. What a fascinating conversation. And thanks for inviting Nigel.
Yes, it was great. I think it works well with three.
We'll do it again.
It'd be interesting to know what other people feel, whether they like us having guests or they just really want to hear us.
Well, yes, indeed. And how I've managed or not to make the Zooms work. Talk to you later.
Well, talk to you later. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to the Scandalmongers podcast. This has been a Podcast World production. You can get in contact with our show by emailing team@podcastworld.org, placing Scandalmongers in the heading, or via our social media links within the show's bio.